Are in the world. I'm Ioana Petrescu, Global Fellow at ESPI, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to the third session of the Space Economics Seminar. This is a seminar that is jointly organized with the Ownership Project at the Harvard Business School and the European Space Policy Institute. The strong turnout for the first two seminars really showed that there is a lot of appetite for this topic and for really bringing rigorous economic analysis into space policy. And today we're going to continue to build that community by having a mix of practitioner and academic giving a talk. And I like to repeat the rules of the seminar for the ones who are maybe joining us the first time. So please keep your microphone muted unless called on, and post the questions in the chat during the talk. After a 30-minute presentation by our speaker, I'll call the participant for a live Q&A. At that point, your mics will be unmuted. Please don't interrupt the speakers because usually we have a large audience and that would really interrupt the flow. The session is recorded, so if you haven't completed the attendance and the consent form for being recorded, please do so. Tony will put a link to that form in the Q&A, so you can do that. And of course, the obvious, we are expecting questions and comments that are related to the talk. And so with that, it's a great pleasure for me to introduce today's speaker. So Dr. Katrin Nyman-Metcalf, she is an adjunct professor of law at the Tallinn University of Technology. She is also an international authority on outer space law, e-governance, cybersecurity, and legal dimensions of emerging technologies. She has chaired ESA's International Relations Committee and has published extensively in space law, digital rights, and regional integration. Today, she presents something that is called Who Owns the Moon, Stars, and the Orbit. And I think it is great that we have this timely examination of how the foundation rule of space can be used but not appropriated, and how these laws are stress tested by real world issues like space resources extraction, mega constellation, increasingly congested orbits. As space becomes less infinite, the legal and economic consequences become unavoidable. And Katrin, the floor is yours. You have 30 minutes for your very interesting presentation. Thank you very much for being in this seminar.
Thank you. Thank you for that kind introduction, and thank you for inviting me to speak about a topic that I did my PhD thesis on 26 years ago. I defended it. So it would be nice to say that I was such a visionary, so I was the only one who realized then that the topic was relevant, but unfortunately that's not the case. But this is rather a case of something which is perhaps a bit surprising for a high-tech area like space, that sometimes the law moves rather slowly and questions remain on the table for a long time. And the question of appropriation or use of outer space is actually exactly one of those questions that sort of doesn't go away. So I will now try to share my presentation, and I think you should be able to see it now. So indeed, the title, Who Owns the Moon, the Stars, and the Orbits, trying to make it sound a little bit more catchy than just saying the sort of ownership and appropriation and use of outer space. But indeed, that's pretty much what we'll talk about. So let me see if it is also possible to change the slides. Indeed. So I know that, from what I've been told at least, that in the audience will be those who are very well familiar with space and space law, and maybe some that are not. So I'm sure that what I'll start with is a bit of repetition for some of you, but repetition is the mother of all learning, as we know. So it's anyway important to set the scene by starting with some fairly basic principles of outer space law. And Maybe just very briefly, because I know not all of you have a legal background, perhaps many don't, that sometimes people are almost surprised. And when I say people, I mean both actually lawyers not dealing with space and space people not dealing with law, that we have as much space law as we actually have, because it's still seen perhaps as being something very exotic, and how can you regulate something like that? But as a matter of fact, there are fairly well established principles of outer space law. And relevant for our topic today, what they say about who can own space is primarily that outer space is the province of all mankind. It's important to actually pay attention to the words, because I'm going to talk about heritage of mankind in a minute, but here it is the province of all mankind. Obviously, these words as such don't have a, say, given legal meaning. They have the meaning they're given through these treaties. This is in the very first article of the Outer Space Treaty, which put the full name of it is the Treaty on Principles Governing Activities of States and the Exploration and Use of Space, including Moon and Celestial Bodies. The treaty from 1967, which has, at the moment, is about 118, possibly 119 parties to this treaty. It's relevant to know that only this year, for instance, Malaysia joined the treaty, ratified it in September, Latvia in May or June, I think something like that. So countries are still joining this treaty, and it is seen to be the most relevant legal instrument for outer space. It also contains that outer space cannot be appropriated by anyone, but it can be used by all states. And furthermore, states are responsible for their subjects, but it's clear that also private subjects can use space. This is something that has been discussed perhaps in general, sort of more, say, popular media quite a lot relatively recently, with lots of private space activities, where sometimes it's presented as if these are just people who sort of basically start doing things in space on their own volition. But actually, the treaties do foresee that that it is possible to have private activities. It was only that nobody really perhaps thought it was going to be a big thing when the treaty was written. The treaty includes the same principles that were set out in a Declaration of Legal Principles, which was a UN General Assembly resolution, which are not binding, but can be very important, especially when there is yet no binding law on the topic, as was the case. So basically, these principles that I've now mentioned date back to 1963. So they are well established. Again, just briefly for perhaps non-lawyers, that in international law, we have two main sources of law: treaties and customary law. Customary law being what it sounds like, custom, but something that states not only do, but they do it because they think they are obliged to do it. And normally custom would, as the word indicates, be something that goes on for some time. But actually it was in space law where the notion instant customary law was launched. Because just as violations of international law aren't worse because there are many of them, because if there is one or a few, but they are huge, they are more important perhaps. And in the same way, custom doesn't have to be over a long time if there is a lot of agreement about what the principles are in relatively short time, especially in an area where there isn't that much going on if we start sort of, say, counting activities. So these principles that I mentioned are also seen to be customary law. Common heritage of mankind, so slightly different words, not province anymore. So if we say that the province of mankind is well accepted, the common heritage of mankind was like a next step. Again, the words don't mean anything that different, perhaps, but what was put into this notion of common heritage of mankind was that there should be a system to actually deal with what you can do in a common area. And this notion, when it comes to outer space, is found in an agreement usually called by short the Moon Agreement, agreement governing the activities of states on the moon and other celestial bodies. It was drafted in 1979. It entered into force in 1984, and that was the first thing that set it apart from the other space treaties. It took actually several years to get enough ratifications. And even today, it has only, I think it was 17, yes, 17 countries have ratified it, compared to 119 for the previous treaty. None of the space powers have ratified this agreement, and it's usually seen as perhaps being irrelevant. Why I'm mentioning it is because it is actually, it would have been, let's say, if it weren't irrelevant, exactly topical for the question of ownership to space resources, because that was the very reason to actually draft this treaty. And when it talks of the moon and is usually referred to as the Moon Agreement, it actually includes other celestial bodies. And they say then in the provisions of that treaty that the moon and the celestial bodies and their natural resources are common heritage of mankind. And what this means is that then we come to the next step, that there is actually a system, an international regime, which includes various procedures for exploiting any natural resources of the moon or other celestial bodies when such exploration is about to become feasible. It wasn't yet when the treaty was written. Many of you may actually recognize this notion of common heritage of mankind, and indeed this idea of creating a system from the deep seabed, because we have that same notion in the Treaty on the Law of the Sea, and there is a body set up, headquartered in Jamaica, to deal with exactly the common heritage of the deep seabed. So it's wrong to say that this idea is a total failure. At the same time, if some of you have not heard about this Deep Seabed Authority, it's not so surprising because it cannot be said to be a particularly well-known or very relevant authority, or this system cannot be said to be accepted. It's really not accepted to be customary law that if there is a resource in a common area, there is also a practical system to exploit it. And as this system for space has never been set up, no point in spending too much time on going on about what it includes, but just to understand what this system means, is this international regime, it's so that if you exploit something, a state or a private company with a license of a state, you also have to basically pay something to a common system. So it's in a way a kind of more complicated taxation system to basically put some flesh on the bones of the idea of this being a common property, but never set up for space. Why I'm talking about it anyway is that now we are in an era where it is feasible to exploit resources. So clearly people are kind of going back and reading this treaty again and thinking that would there be a future in doing something like this? Exactly like it is, hardly, because if exactly this idea would be acceptable to states, they already have this presented and haven't caught on to it. But as an idea, to try to sort of answer the question of what kind of uses are then allowed in a common area, it's interesting to at least know it exists. So the big question with this, from these principles, comes really to, so what is permitted use of space and what is banned appropriation? Because these notions exist in the treaties, including the big one, if we say the Outer Space Treaty, the accepted notion. But it's not explained what is, when does basically use become appropriation. If we just stick to the sort of language, they would seem to be quite different words. But the thing is that if you use something, nobody else can use exactly that same thing in exactly the same way at exactly the same time. So the question is, when does such use become so much of a hindrance for others that it already looks more like appropriation? This should be seen, if we look at the totality of the space law, always keeping in mind that we're talking of something which is the province of mankind, which belongs to everybody. So basically, if you're using something in a manner that takes away any benefit from anybody else, it looks to have been going too far. But there is no easy way of saying where is this limit. The Outer Space Treaty is vague. Um, that may be one reason why it's remained relevant. As I mentioned, countries are still joining it. It's nearly 60 years old. Because it was written to be given more flesh on the bones by other things like practice, other treaties, national law, and so on. So it was never intended to sort of basically answer everything. But another reason it was vague was it was not written really for resource exploitation. It was written to set general principles, and it was also written to avoid conflict. So it was much more focused on creating a framework for states to cooperate, in which it has been successful, if only by the fact that it has so many parties, but also how in the fairly cold period of the Cold War, when it was agreed in the 1960s, the big space powers at the times, with the US and the Soviet Union, didn't agree on much in those days, or any other days for that matter, but managed to come together with certain principles for space. So it's not a criticism of the treaty to say that it's vague, but it definitely means that now when we're talking of different types of questions, of actual practical use of space, it doesn't say very much. And we've seen in other areas of international law that once there is a question of actual, sort of say, well, money basically, of extracting something and having sort of resources used for something, then it tends to be much more difficult to agree, first of all, but also it doesn't really work to have these kind of vague principles, because when we're talking of private actors, the legal system has to be completely different. For as long as there was pretty much only state actors, states solve things diplomatically, so the vagueness isn't such a big issue. But private companies aren't going to launch millions of euros or dollars or something else into space without knowing whether what to do is actually legal and can be protected. So many questions have arisen. There were some authors who, back in the early 70s, launched the notions of a difference between stock and flow resources in space, meaning that stock resources would be minerals and things like that, where it was more difficult, they felt, to see that you could actually use this to any great extent without basically appropriating it. Whereas orbits and so flow resources, also different types of energy. And so basically lots of different users could probably have access to it. So this distinction also, first of all, the words didn't really catch on that much, but also the distinction doesn't really help us too much, because if there are, like we have now, mega constellations with a huge number of satellites, they may be filling up so many orbits so that anyway nobody else can actually use these And if you then say that, okay, well, the rest of space is still there, if this is not usable, it still looks more like an appropriation than just use. And talking about orbits, it's not new to find also use of orbits as a form of appropriation, because the main challenges to this idea of like leaving it open, what's appropriation or use, one of those is actually something called the Bogota Declaration from 1976 already, when a number of countries, all based on the equator, claimed that the geostationary orbit belonged to them. And I'm sure most of you know, but the geostationary orbit is the one which is 35,900 kilometers above the equator. And what's special with it is that anything placed there moves the same speed as Earth. So it looks like it's still. In the 1970s, this was thought to be the most interesting orbit because you could have an antenna directed in one place. You didn't need to move it. Geostationary orbit is still interesting, but actually technology quite soon showed that it wasn't the only interesting orbit. And for many things, it's actually too high up to be very interesting. But the Bogota Declaration, it hasn't been sort of taken back by these countries. It still exists. Ecuador still has in its constitution that the geostationary orbit is part of its territory. But none of the countries in this declaration have any way sort of really acted on it. And I wouldn't say it's seen as obsolete, but it's just perhaps seen as insignificant. Because basically their argumentation was that this orbit was so specific that it wasn't part of the rest of outer space, and that's why it could be sort of taken in a way which kind of was a bit of a well, perhaps a bit of kind of a stretched argumentation. The idea was that they would be getting licensing money from people using that orbit. But it sort of went away, the problem in a way, or at least diminished because of technological progress in using other orbits. So what we're perhaps more looking at today are national laws on space resources. And the question here is pretty much the same. And so what is it that actually is allowed when it comes to resource use? You will find many critics of the idea that countries are passing legislation before this has been clarified by international law. None of these countries that have passed laws are saying that they are intending to violate international law. On the opposite side, they are all claiming, stating clearly that they are passing legislation which is in line with the international principles that they have signed up to. So we're basically, again, in this sphere of not really knowing what is the difference between appropriation and use, saying that use of resources is a permitted use, and this includes different types of minerals and mining on different forms of celestial bodies. It's not appropriation. Appropriation would be if you take a whole celestial body or an area of it, put fences up and say this is only ours. As long as you're not doing that, everybody can basically use space. But as I already said many times, that doesn't really solve the question that if somebody's using it very intensively, others don't have anything left of it. The countries that have legislation are the United States, which maybe is less surprising because it has the most space law anyway. It's leading space power. And the provisions are in an act from 2015. Luxembourg is maybe in a way more interesting, at least for us in Europe, because it's more unusual that European country is that let's say innovative about space, and it's a very conscious decision by Luxembourg to pass this law because the idea is to make Luxembourg a hub for space activities in Europe, which there have been for a long time. Actually, lots of satellite companies were based there already in the 1970s and onwards. And they also put resources into tempting companies that are interested in space extraction to base themselves in Luxembourg, which is, as you know, a member of the European Union. So it's in that sense also attractive for companies. And then we also have the United Arab Emirates and Japan that have also passed legislation, which in both cases promote basically space activities, including extraction of resources. And the way these systems all work is that basically it's a licensing system, so very similar to what we have say, in communications and so. So companies apply for licenses and then to fulfill various demands, and if that is all done okay, then they will be given a license to deal with the exploration of space resources. And what one can say about this main question again about the appropriation or use is that remains unresolved to that extent that none of these laws purport to solve it. And say there are big discussions whether this shouldn't have been solved by international law before countries started making their own laws, but the countries are saying, well, it wasn't solved by international law, so how long can we wait when now the exploration is actually possible? And it actually adds itself to a list of unresolved space questions because we still don't have a decision about where space begins. This for resources is actually less important because it's worked. The space age has functioned for more than 60 years without a limit of what is space and what is airspace, and it's actually not really created any problems. And when it comes to resources, they don't tend to be in this potentially sort of disputed zone anyway. So, but it's just interesting to know that we actually still don't have a definition even of space. And also with this, how benefit of mankind should be evaluated. So it's what it actually means, this province of mankind, and so also is something which is still discussion rather than something where we can point to exactly what it's supposed to mean. And of course, the peaceful uses is another one of those questions that keeps being discussed. So just to round up, and then we have the time for discussion. So maybe some of you have heard, maybe some of you even own a little plot of land on the moon. It's been possible ever since sometime in the 1990s to buy such plots of land. And I'm mentioning this because it tends to be something people have perhaps heard of, but it's something called Lunar Embassy. It's a website where you can buy these relatively cheaply, which I think is on purpose because it means that most people who do buy such a plot of land probably are aware that it's a little bit legally funny. I mean, these people who sell it have absolutely no more right to sell it than anybody else. So, but if you buy something, I mean, expensive, you would be worried about the legal situation. But if it is, I don't know, $50 or something like that, you may do it as a fun thing. So why I'm mentioning it just because the question could arise, well, if it is so clearly against space law, how come or against international law and space law, how come it's been going on for decades? Because it is clearly, I mean, this is appropriation. You can't sell a plot of land on the moon, but it's still, nothing's really happened about this. And I think that is probably because it's always just been seen as a silly thing. Nobody's taken it seriously enough to actually do anything about that. And it perhaps is also a little bit indicative of the thinking around this, that it's all kind of like still has been seen, at least things going on in space, as exotic and something that you don't have to get too much into details. It sort of doesn't matter too much. So my very final point before opening up for your many comments and discussion, I hope, is So when do we come to a point where we just have to regulate? And this is a similar situation in many high-tech areas. As was mentioned when I was introduced, I work, apart from outer space, I work a lot with cyberspace issues. And now, of course, AI, as anybody who works with law and tech works with those questions. So you always come to a point where you have to basically decide when is the right time to try to regulate more specifically, like how developed should the technology be? If you wait too long, maybe very difficult to put the genie back in the bottle. You can't really regulate things unless they're developed enough. You don't want to stifle innovation. You need to know the definitions, but at the same time, if you make them too precise, you may lock yourself in. And in a way, I mean, these questions are not something you can just provide a solution to. And often it actually works to interpret the questions rather than to try to sort of regulate it. But you also come to a point, and I think when it comes to space resources, if you have the impression I've given you more questions than answers, I would agree with that. But I think we've come to a point perhaps where this vagueness, it's maybe this is maybe that, is becoming more and more difficult. So I leave you with a picture of Tallinn, and I look forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you so much, Katrin. Thank you for shedding some light on this extremely interesting topic. It's for a person like me who does not have a legal background. This was fascinating, and indeed, it seems like we have a lot of comments and questions. So I'm gonna try to get as many of them in the order in which they were written on the chat. So Anthony, I see you have a question about congested orbits, debris proliferation, things like that. Would you like to ask your question? Anthony da Costa.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. The question is very simple. The laws are vague, and yet we have some things going on in practice. So then, how do the laws then, in the end, interact with those practices? In other words, using up orbits means somebody else doesn't get it. So then the question is, what are the laws doing here? And are they just simply there and people know that they're there, but nothing really is happening otherwise? So I just wanted to hear that. And I guess I didn't put this
Mm.
question down, but it occurred to me also that, we talk about, nature. I go on a lot of hikes, and I'd rather have them as they are. I mean, why are we so hell bent on, let's say, innovations, um, as being something that is being hindered because of the laws? Just leave it as they are. So this is more of a philosophical question. In other words, we have these resources and let them be as they are without necessarily of any kind of human intervention. Now, this could be obviously somewhat provocative for people who always think of technological progress as being this teleological kind of development, that it must always occur. Why not put a stop to it? That's it.
Well, as you said, this was probably philosophical. Yeah, I mean, it would be too long perhaps to go into all of that, but no, you're absolutely right in that one easily could say that one of the ideas of this common heritage or common province, and the difference between province and heritage also is it really, like, if one goes deeper into these notions, that the heritage also really is what we leave to the future generations. And so indeed, one idea between making these kind of systems for extracting resources was to actually not extract too much, but basically sometimes perhaps decide not to do it. So, but as I said, for space, this system hasn't really been created, or I mean, it hasn't been created, let's say, it was just created on paper. But to come to the role of the laws, the way that it still matters, I would say, is this idea that also the countries that have passed laws, the next step is that those who want to extract something should ask for a license. And it is possible, and it's not just theoretical, but also that you are not granted a license. So actually, if there is really, would be seen that somebody is totally making it impossible for others to use these, whether they're orbits then or something else, the way to do it would be to not give them the license to do it. International law is unfortunately always a little bit weak in the sense that we don't have global police or courts or anything like that. So we're relying on countries to be serious and do this. Those countries that I mentioned that have passed legislation on space extraction, resource extraction, actually all would fall into the category of responsible countries, hopefully. They have also said that they partly passed legislation because if extraction is going to start, it's better to have a system for it, and they can then say yes or no to licenses rather than just everybody doing it anyway, sort of thing. So there is, in that sense, the laws aren't just cosmetic or so, but whether that is guarantee, I would actually prefer not to be strong on that, because you could also have a country that totally ignores international law, as we see in too many different situations. That could also happen in space, that they just totally don't care. We have, of course, big private companies now, all the really big players, all American based, and we have colorful personalities active in space, as we all know. It has so far at least worked to some extent to get people to actually behave a bit responsibly, even Elon Musk. That it's kind of like, I would say that it's not as if people are just doing absolutely whatever they like in space at the moment. At least it's actually possible to point to this idea of it being something for everybody. So.
Thank you so much, Katrin. And I see Nabil has a question about preventing systemic inequity in benefiting from space. Would you like to ask your question, Nabil?
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much for the time. Also, thank you very much again for the very thought-provoking session, Catherine. I think I would just wrap up the question as a very simple as a question on regards to how do you think that the current legal framework, so to say, is adequate enough to make sure that equitable access to space activities is managed well, and make sure that those that actually has de facto access to space, well, basically, can we enforce the non-appropriation principle to them, to ensure that they don't actually do things that are beyond the boundaries of what they should be doing in space, such as you mentioned before, claiming space and etc. Because I think I'm seeing this as a gray areas that is such that it, I'm drawing parallel from how we used to develop the sustainability concepts before the Paris agreements, until eventually it became a carbon credit transfer idea, and then suddenly it becomes a nationally determined contribution, and then each country has to develop their own taxonomies. I'm just considering whether do you think what's the closest model here that can approach equitable access to space and ensure that non-appropriation principle is upheld? Thank you.
First of all, I would say, unfortunately, I don't think the system today is really guaranteeing equitable access. I think it is, and it's been much discussed ever since space law was created and space age began. It's good that you used the word equitable, because everybody has agreed long time ago we cannot talk about equal access, because actually that would be very difficult, like because countries are so different, and they're talking about equal access. And that was a discussion also earlier on, that you should basically just decide how much of space, like how much orbits and so countries could have. But of course, as some countries were not using anything, it would have meant you really would have stop development, because others could then not go ahead. And anyway, that didn't seem to be practical, because we find out new orbits that can be used and so on. But I would say the system does not really guarantee it, because it's the countries that have the resources to use space that can do so. And although the idea is that you don't block it forever, I would say the only perhaps actual functioning such system is for satellite orbits under the International Telecommunications Union, where it was actually added after this Bogota Declaration as one of the consequences of this declaration. So rather than saying certain orbits belong to somebody by right, there is a provision in the ITU constitution about how orbital positions are given out. And for instance, there also you cannot block a position, you have to actually use it. So it's a sort of licensing system to make sure that it's not used. So, and also what has been, so what is sort of more positive, if the actual pure law picture leaves a lot of questions unanswered, there are also lots of non-binding instruments, like we call soft law instruments, that function relatively well. So countries so far, the main area of that is not really to do with the ownership, but it's to do with the debris, with all the junk in space, where there is nothing in a binding agreement or treaty. But there are a number of different guidelines and things, and they tend to actually be followed, because I think countries see that everybody has an interest in that, and sort of it's more difficult geopolitically for countries to sit down and say, okay, yes, I agree with what you tell me, you, my enemy, you're telling me this and I'll agree with that. No, I can't do that in the current global situation, but I can quietly do the same thing without sort of publicizing it. So that sort of works. So I think some kind of system similar to what the ITU has, where they have a whole range of different things that they take into consideration. So geographical position, socioeconomic status of countries, what is the actual use for? Because it's not so easy as to say that the benefit of mankind is just like everybody does the same thing, because development can be benefit for mankind even if it tends to come from certain countries only. So I think some form of this maybe created actually by non-binding instruments. The problem with that is exactly in the name itself, that if they're not binding, your other question of how well can we enforce it, that we can't really, but we cannot really enforce the binding rules either, unfortunately, at the moment. So there's a liability convention also for outer space. Many of you probably know it, which sets up an exact system for what you do if you're damaged, or if there is some damage to your country or your subjects from space activities. And that convention from 1972 has never been properly applied. I mean, it exists, it's in force and everything, but the system for it has not been used. So countries aren't really enforcing anyway. So.
Thank you, Katrin. I see Luisa has a question about the legal implications of space mining. Luisa, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah.
Hi.
Thank you, Katrin, hi, Jon. Thank you, Katrin, for your presentation. I have a query concerning the exploitation of resources with space mining. You mentioned before that countries can grant licenses for space resources exploitation, and I'm wondering specifically, there is now an increasing number of countries that are thinking of extract, for example, lithium, cobalt, platinum from asteroids. Now let's think about China. Do you think China will ever subdue to, for example, laws that are establishing that countries may actually grant licenses? For example, they will never subdue to US laws in this specific instance. So what is your specific view about, space mining and the relationship with international laws?
Well, I think the main reason we haven't had more problems with space mining is probably actually nothing to do with the law, but the fact that it until now has not been really interesting to do it economically. So the technology already, when I was doing the research for my thesis nearly 30 years ago, the technology sort of existed for mining from asteroids, for instance, but it's still very expensive and very complicated. So as long as you can find those same resources on Earth or deep seabed, where it's Earth as well, then it's just hasn't really taken off. So for the moment, I would say that the way the national laws would work is that those countries that have laws can then give licenses for a certain asteroid mining. Other countries would not necessarily, as you say as well, respect that this is given. But I think at the same time, they probably wouldn't try to hinder this in any way, or so that they wouldn't, if the company is given the right to do this, I wouldn't see another country trying to go there and physically, actually stop that sort of company from doing it. What would happen if space resource mining became much more interesting is that there might be conflicting licenses given, because countries, like say, China wouldn't accept the US license, US probably wouldn't accept the Chinese license, so they might be giving the same license for the same resources and the same asteroid. At the moment, there's nothing really preventing that, more from, say, common sense and from the space treaties, which are general and vague, saying that, you have to do it in the interest of everybody. There are also actually provisions a little bit more specific than that about how you have to give information about your space activities, you have to be transparent about it and so on. But still, if there was absolutely no goodwill from the countries, then that could potentially happen. We're not there yet, and in space, it kind of, as I mentioned, the debris example, there is some positive signs of countries actually trying to create systems to avoid these kind of things. So, but the legal system doesn't really totally prevent it. So.
Yes.
Thank you. And Mark, I see you have a number of questions around exclusion zones and de facto property rights and shadow appropriation. Would you like to ask them?
Sure, thanks. So thanks for the talk. So yeah, what about the notion of exclusion zones, for example, around a resource extraction operation or just a landing site? Could we expect this to become proto or de facto property rights in future? So kind of shadow appropriation without formally claiming these rights. Also thinking about history, of course. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I would say the short answer would be yes. I think exactly that nobody is maybe saying that we are appropriating. And it's important to perhaps, because I think we all, of course, know the image of the American flag being put on the moon, that the Americans at the time even made a point of saying that this is not appropriation. They're not claiming it. They're just kind of putting the flag there for mankind and this kind of thing. So, but yes, I think this is very likely that even if nobody will say, maybe somebody would as well, but I think that's perhaps at the moment, at least no countries are willing to go up and, challenge the idea of non-appropriation, but they would just say, well, actually, you can't come here because it's for sort of destroying for us or something. And I would say that those ideas that exist about bases on different planets and even private companies have sort of such ideas. They basically always present them as a form of appropriation, I would say, yes. So there it's again, I think at the moment the question hasn't really come to its sort of sharpest point because it hasn't been done yet. But yes, I would say that is actually a real question, and that may be something that actually pushes this whole big question of appropriation or use, that we have to decide something more specific, because otherwise we're just going to have it would be like saying we all own a big garden together, but I've just actually built houses all over it and I've picked all the fruit and everything. You still have you still basically own it, but you can absolutely do nothing. And I mean, that's not really non-appropriation.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Maria, I see you have a comment / a question about what we can learn from the deep seabed mining regime. Would you like to?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Joanna, and thank you so much, Katrin, for the presentation. I think the analogy is not new. Obviously, I think there's been a lot written on the topic of deep seabed mining serving as a potential, let's say, comparative legal regime to space resources utilization. My question is, have you ever looked more specifically into the licenses that are granted to these economic operators? So in the US, for example, it was in the 1980s, Lockheed Martin, I believe. How do those licenses, let's say, really determine the question of ownership, or do they even touch upon the question of ownership when the public authority grants a license to an economic operator?
As far as I know, and I did look at this, but a long time ago, so I'm here a little bit nervous of saying something too categorically. But as far as I remember, no, I think they're relatively clear on the fact that you do not get ownership to the site, definitely not, but you have the right to extract the resources. But the idea is that you do not claim the actual sort of certain bit of the deep seabed or anything like that. And the use of the resources, so you get the ownership to the resource that you take away in a way that you could say is a form of appropriation. That also for space, I think most of those who have written about this or commented about it say that if there could be nothing, that you could take nothing away from space, then it would be very difficult to see what the use really could be. Then it should have been clear from the beginning that use is only moving about in space, like orbits or so. But that hasn't been made clear. So probably you can actually extract something. The question is also then, is it a renewable resource or not? Because if it's renewable, you could say it's actually no problem to say that this is a use and not appropriation, because others can come to the same spot. If it is a non-renewable resource, of course, again, you come to a point where it's difficult to see. So what's left for others, the fact that the bit of land is not taken if everything from it is taken. But when it comes to the actual ownership of the sites, I would say that's relatively clear also for the seabed, that you do not get. You just get the right to use it. And the idea of the deep seabed is this, that you then also extract something from another site, which is then given to the authority, or like basically given to mankind. And that was the same idea for celestial bodies. So it also shows that you do not get a piece of the seabed or a planet, but you just get the right to use it. But you do get the right to own what you've taken out from there.
Thank you. I'll skip the questions which already received answers in the chat for the sake of time. And I'll ask Christian if he wants to ask his question about the Artemis Accords, of course. Christian, are you still here? Should I ask a question? So the question is, could you please share your view on the legal quality of the Artemis Accords? Will they be used at least as a resource for interpreting the Out-of-Space Treaty? It's the question.
Yes, and the Artemis Accords are accords about sort of use of celestial bodies. So yes, I would say that they are one of these, and it's not the same kind of instrument as was I mentioned when I talked of soft law, which is non-binding instruments, because this is a sort of a binding agreement between those who are parties to it, the European Space Agency and the US and others. And I think, yes, it can be seen as one a building block in trying to create sort of better understanding or answers of these questions. They're not, when it comes to, say, interpretation of these principles, they're quite specific, the Artemis Accords. They're sort of setting out a specific mission or specific missions, and what that will look like. So they don't add so very much more to what we already perhaps have. More than that, it's a practical step, and it's an international agreement. So it's good in that sense that it adds sort of language about how you do a joint international mission about something, but it doesn't really go into these like what can be done and what not. I mean, it's sort of presupposing that it is countries are agreeing on something which is allowed to do under the use of space, and putting it in a certain framework. So it's a kind of yes and no answer. Yes, it's useful, but it doesn't really answer any more questions. It's just a practical, perhaps, implementation of this vague principle.
And Katrin, Niha has a question about whether anyone has asked if humans have the right to use space. Would you like to ask that question?
Yes. No, I like that question because that's always I have a chapter in my thesis as well about space aliens. It's always nice to go a bit to the more I don't know if we call it fun side or something. So, but no, the question has been asked, and one thing to say about space law is that it is about human activities in space. We all who talk about it tend to just call it sort of law of outer space, generally or a bit vaguely. But if one looks more specifically, it's quite clear that what we're talking about is legislation on human activities. So in the parts of space, the types of activities that humans can do. The question whether humans should use space at all was actually discussed quite a lot in the very early days of the space age. And then it's interesting now to go back to these old books and so, because so little was known about space that actually very serious authors were also discussing what about when we meet other creatures, aliens? Should we also make laws or rules about how we interact with them and so, because it was actually seen as a specific sort of thing that might happen. That has kind of gone into the background now, so it's seen more perhaps as this kind of science fiction thing that if we do meet life from outer space, it might be so totally different from us. Like I think we don't think necessarily it's going to be little green men with an American accent who kind of come and talk to us. So it's perhaps not an issue discussed much sort of in that sense now. But the other way this question has come up a little bit more seriously, perhaps, is from this sort of environmental protection perspective, which was something not thought about when the space treaties were written. Also interesting, we forget how relatively new it is that we talk of environmental risks. It wasn't a big thing 60, 70 years ago. I mean, environment was a big thing, but people weren't aware of it. But what we can see is that because the question has come up later when space activities already exist, we already have lots of satellites, we have more and more use of space. It's not really possible to say, okay, we should totally stop using space because it might be damaging for environment and so. So the question is really how to try to use it more sustainably, and there the space junk again is a huge question, how to try to avoid that there's more and more of that. Also various types of contamination and so. It's been discussed, should humans use space at all? But I think the conclusion, if we can say that, there's been a conclusion, is that yes, okay, we're already using space, we can do it, so let's try to do it more responsibly.
Thank you very much. And I think this is the last question for you because we're approaching the end. Thank you very much, Katrin, for your really thought-provoking talk. And to all of you for really providing such an engaged discussion. I see that there are much more comments in the chat. I'm sorry I couldn't take more of it. A quick look ahead just before we close off. On December 16, we have Louisa. She's already in the seminar today as well. And she's a research fellow at the University of Cambridge, and she's going to talk about technology spillovers from the final frontier, a long-run view from the US space innovation. So we're back to talking hardcore economics from law. And looking forward, I was mentioning at the very beginning that this is a pilot season, and luckily I am happy to announce that it has been a very good pilot, and we will continue the seminar series next semester, monthly from January to May. And dates will be circulated soon. Also, we'll have a call for papers for papers to be presented in the seminar next semester. We're trying to pick the best 4 papers we can possibly find. So this will be an open call for papers you can share with people from outside the seminar. And with that, thank you, Katrin, again. Thank you again for joining us. And I am looking forward to seeing you all back on December 16. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.